Hello, I'm John Borrego. I am the interim priest at St. John's Episcopal Church in Norman, Oklahoma. And this will be the last of a series of talks about the development of early Christianity. We have looked already at some of the issues that began in the first centuries of Christianity, how Christian communities grew up in different places around the Roman Empire, and how different sacred writings were considered to be holy books by one community or another. Many of them beyond what eventually became the New Testament. Today I'd like to talk about the increasing institutionalization of the church and how it developed structures of governance, or as we call it in ecclesiastical language, polity. We have spoken of the persecution of Christians, which went on sporadically through the time of the end of the 3rd century, in some places and times more terrible than others. But at the same time, Christianity was beginning to take root and become more understood and more widely known among the citizens of the Roman Empire. When we get to about the 180s AD, we find that the bishop of the city of Lyon in France, whose name was Irenaeus, writes a book called Against the Heresies. He is speaking of what he refers to as the true faith and discipline of the church, rejecting other forms of Christianity that he says are invalid and wrong and, to use his term, heretical. By the time of Irenaeus, we begin to see that the New Testament canon and the structure of authority in the church are beginning to take on shapes that look very much like what we see in later centuries and even down to our own time. In his book, Against the Heresies, the Bishop of Lyon, Irenaeus, quotes 21 of the 27 books of the New Testament. He probably didn't have a book on his desk called the Bible yet at this point, but certainly he believed that these writings were more authoritative and more to be respected than those used by other Christian sects here and there. He only accepts the 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as being proper and valid. He compares the number 4 of the Gospels to the 4 winds of the world and the 4 pillars of the earth. Why would there be any more than that, he says? These are the ones that go back to the authority of Jesus and the apostles themselves, and are therefore to be properly accepted and treated with proper reverence. Other writings used by some Christian groups, he says, are written recently and they come out of the imaginations of their writers. He also speaks of the authority of bishops and priests, which he says, again, as the Gospels themselves do, descend from the teachings and the life and the ministry of the apostles themselves. He believed that there was an unbroken line from the teachings of the disciples of Jesus, who became the traveling evangelists that went around the Roman world to bring the gospel to all of the communities they came to, between them and other bishops, including himself, who taught by the same authority. He used the example of the church in Rome. He says this was clearly founded, as we know, by the disciples Peter and Paul, the apostles Peter and Paul themselves. And therefore, their traditions, their teachings have been handed down in unbroken succession for this period of 150 years or so, down to our own time. Our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters use this as one piece of evidence for the authority of the bishops of Rome as the Pope, as the universal leader of all of Christianity. Christianity is becoming a universal belief, and those that deviate from that are considered to be out of line and wrong. The word universal in Greek is katholos, from which we get our word Catholic. The church is becoming Catholic, the same in one place as it is in another. Now, as I said, these persecutions of Christians had continued sporadically in one place and another. There was a particular short ruling emperor in the middle of the 3rd century who was known as Philip the Arabian, having been born in what we would now call Syria, that was called the province of Arabia by the Romans at the time. Philip ruled between 244 and 249 AD, and the Roman historian Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, believes that Philip himself was in fact a Christian. We have no compelling evidence for this, but Eusebius does tell a story that at least suggests that Philip was sympathetic to Christianity. He says that Philip attended the great vigil of Easter, the service on the night before Easter Sunday when new converts were baptized into the faith and the resurrection of Christ was celebrated. He was not allowed to come into this service because the bishop imposed upon him a penance of some kind. We don't know what that was for, what sins he was asked to expiate, and we don't know for sure where this took place. Some would say it was in Rome itself. Some would say it was in Antioch, back closer to Philip's hometown. So that is suggestive but not dispositive. But we do know that the previous persecutions were very much ameliorated under Philip's reign. He was eventually assassinated, and the Roman emperors went back to persecuting Christians. Perhaps the worst persecutions took place towards the end of the 3rd century under the Roman Emperor Diocletian. While some emperors had been accorded divine titles and honors in the past, he was the first to claim that for himself. He used the titles in addition to the common ones of the Roman emperors. He called himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. And in his depictions on coins, he is shown with rays of light coming out of his head. And being, as he saw it, the Lord and God, he did not want any competition from these Christians. After Diocletian's time, there was a period of civil war where the empire was divided and the rule was handed back and forth among several different claimants to the imperial throne. But finally, it is brought back together under one emperor whom history remembers as Constantine the Great. Constantine was born in 272 AD in Britain. He rose through the ranks as a soldier, was eventually made a sort of co-emperor at one point, and finally managed to overcome his rivals and took the throne completely in his own name for himself in the year 324 AD. There is a story that is told about Constantine that before one of the important battles with one of his rivals, he had a dream in which he saw a vision of the Greek letters chi and rho standing above the glare of the sun, and he heard a voice saying to him in Latin, "By this sign you shall conquer." Chi and rho, letters in the Greek alphabet, are the first two letters of the word Christos, Christ. He had his soldiers put this symbol on their shields, and there are depictions of Constantine himself with the symbol shown on his helmet. And so he attributed his victory in that battle, which went a long way towards making him the sole emperor, to the intervention of the Christian God. Now, was this what was responsible for Constantine's conversion to Christianity? We don't really know for sure. His mother, Helena, was a Christian, in fact, and it may be that he, as a child and as a young man, absorbed some of the teachings of Christianity at his mother's knee, so to speak. We do know that when finally in 324 he became the sole emperor, he established a series of decrees which made Christianity the favored religion of the Roman Empire. Not the only one, but the one which enjoyed the emperor's favor. He allowed his citizens to worship whatever gods they chose to. But clearly Christianity was the one that he considered the most true and the most important. He built great churches around the empire. If you go to Bethlehem today, to the Basilica of the Nativity, you will see a church built by Constantine that is still very much in the condition in which he left it. Others over the years have been replaced or modified one way or another. He built the first St. Peter's in Rome, which was eventually replaced with the great Renaissance building that stands there today. And his mother, Helena, continued to be an important influence on the church and on Constantine himself. It is said that in a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, she was shown by the Christians in that community where the cross of Jesus himself had been preserved. And to this day, on September the 14th, Christians celebrate the Feast of the Holy Cross, which was the day on which St. Helena was shown the remains of the cross of Christ. Constantine also established Sunday as a day of worship and rest for the empire. So you might say one of the benefits to later civilization was that he invented the weekend. He considered himself quite a theologian. And not long after becoming the sole emperor, he convened a great council of bishops from all over the empire in the city of Nicaea. And he took a very great interest in their debates about the natures of Christ. In what sense was Christ human and in what sense was Christ divine? What do we mean to say that there are three persons in the Trinity? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The arguments were complicated pieces of Neoplatonic theology, which we don't need to go into here, but the important thing was that this was all under the sponsorship of the emperor himself. What finally came out of the Council of Nicaea was a statement of official doctrine of the church. This came to be called the Creed of Nicaea. What we call the Nicene Creed in modern times was actually the product of some changes that were made at a later council in Constantinople. But now there was a standard by which to measure whether you were a proper, believing, Orthodox Christian, or whether you were, to use Irenaeus' term, a heretic. Now, I suppose having a standard confession of faith was good for the organization of the church. But the bad side of this was that it put the power of the state into the hands of the church. Irenaeus wrote books arguing with heretics, but now the church and the state had the authority to do exactly what Christians had endured in the previous centuries, to imprison them, even in some cases to have them executed for deviating from the standard and proper faith of Christianity. Despite the fact that he became a Christian believer, Constantine himself was not baptized until he was on his deathbed. Now, maybe to us moderns we might say, well, that seems a little hypocritical of him. Why wasn't he baptized long before that? But again, as I have said through several of these talks, baptism was considered an absolute break from what had come before into a complete rebirth into a new life in Christ. It was taken with tremendous seriousness by these early Christians, and indeed by Constantine himself. The way he looked at it was that emperors have to do things that really don't accord with the teachings of Christianity. They have to order people to be executed. They have to order soldiers into battle. They have to deal diplomatically sometimes without being entirely honest. So he waited until a time when he would not be called upon or forced to do any of those things before he accepted the sacrament of baptism. Constantine was buried in what was known as the neophyte's gown. When you were baptized in the 4th century, you were baptized naked, as you were at the time of your original birth, because this was your rebirth into a new life. And afterwards, you were given a white gown to show that you had become one of the faithful, the neophyte's gown. And you were given milk and honey, which were not only the foods of the promised land, as it was mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, but also it was baby food, because you were a newborn Christian at that time, and you were finally allowed to participate completely in the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. So, Christianity, through large parts of the world, was the only official and the only legal religion for many, many, many centuries. And as I said, that was sometimes good news and sometimes bad news. It led to salvation and comfort and consolation and the promise of heaven for many, many, many millions of people over all of those centuries. But it also led to suspicion of heretics and eventually to the Crusades to correct the belief and behavior of those who did not accept Christianity. And it really wasn't until the founding of the United States of America and our own Bill of Rights in 1789 that Christianity no longer was an official religion, but was allowed once again to pursue its own ends, its own beliefs, as its leaders and as its members sought to do. So, those are the stories of the early centuries of Christianity, and I thank you very much for listening today.